There is a particular kind of dread that arrives not all at once, but gradually. The way a season changes, you don't notice it on any single day. But one morning you are looking in the mirror, and the person looking back seems to be receding from you, as though something essential is moving further away the more time passes. You feel it in conversations that used to energize you and now exhaust you. You feel it when you look at your calendar and realize that more of your life is behind you than ahead. And that thought does something to your chest that is difficult to name. It is not quite grief. It is not quite fear. It is something closer to the slow recognition that the freedom you always assumed was waiting for you in some future version of your life may not be waiting at all. And the strange thing is that nobody talks about this honestly. The culture offers you two stories about growing older. The first is denial. Stay young, stay active, stay relevant, fill your days so completely that you never have to sit with what aging actually asks of you. The second is resignation. Accept decline, make peace with diminishment, find small pleasures and be grateful for them. Both of these are, in different ways, forms of abandonment. They both leave you alone with the actual question, which is not how to stop aging or how to endure it, but how to grow genuinely freer as you move through it. How to become, in the deepest possible sense, more yourself, more capable of thought, more honest with your own existence, more alive to what this strange experience of being human actually contains. What I want to offer you today is not a program and not a comfort. What I want to offer you is a framework drawn from one of the most rigorous thinkers of the 20th century, a woman who understood freedom not as the absence of constraint, but as the presence of genuine thought. Hannah Arendt spent her life examining what it means to be human in the fullest sense, what it means to think, to act, to belong to the world without being consumed by it. And when I look at her work through the lens of what aging asks of us, I find four pillars, not easy ones, not comfortable ones, but real ones, that have the power to transform the later chapters of a life from a story of loss into something much stranger and more alive than that. If this kind of thinking is what you have been looking for, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. I explore these questions every week, and I would be glad to have you here for the journey. The first pillar is what Arendt called thinking, and by that she did not mean problem solving or information gathering or the kind of mental activity that produces results. She meant something far more radical and far more neglected. She meant the willingness to stop, to turn inward, to examine what you actually believe and why you believe it, to interrogate the assumptions that have been running your life without your conscious permission. Arendt was fascinated by the Socratic tradition precisely because Socrates did not offer answers. He offered questions. He walked through the marketplace not to teach, but to disturb, to interrupt the automatic certainties that people carried around like unexamined luggage, to show them that the things they were most sure of were often the things they had thought about least. Most of us spend the first half of our lives accumulating. We accumulate credentials, relationships, opinions, identities, habits of mind and heart that we carry forward without ever holding them up to the light. We become, in a sense, the sum of our unreflected experiences. And this works more or less while we are busy. The activity of living covers the silence where thinking would happen, but aging has a way of clearing the schedule. It has a way of creating space, sometimes gently and sometimes brutally, where the noise of productivity used to live. And in that space, one of two things happens. Either we rush to fill it with distraction, with busy schedules and constant stimulation, or we discover, perhaps for the first time, the strange country of genuine thought. Arendt wrote about what she called the two-in-one, the internal dialogue that constitutes thinking in its truest form. She meant the experience of being genuinely in conversation with yourself, not the repetitive loop of worry, not the rehearsal of grievances or fears, but the actual examination of what you hold to be true. She described it as being alone without being lonely, as a kind of internal companionship available to anyone willing to stop moving long enough to enter it. This is the first pillar, because without it, the other three are impossible. You cannot begin anything genuinely new if you have never examined what the old patterns actually were. You cannot relate to others with real clarity if you have never sat honestly with your own confusion. You cannot enter the later chapters of life with freedom if you are still being run by conclusions you reached in your 20s and have never revisited. The practice here is not meditation in the contemporary self-help sense, though there is nothing wrong with that. It is something more specifically intellectual, more Socratic. It is the practice of asking yourself about the beliefs and identities you carry most securely, not whether they are comforting, but whether they are true. Many people who reach their 60s and 70s discover, if they are honest, that some of the things they built their lives around were not quite what they seemed. Some of the ambitions that drove them were really other people's ambitions. Some of the fears that constrained them were really inherited fears, received from parents or culture, without examination. The pillar of thinking does not promise that this examination will be pleasant. It promises something more valuable, which is that it will be real. And in the second half of life, reality, however uncomfortable, is the ground of genuine freedom. I know that many of you watching this have been carrying questions about your own life that you have not fully permitted yourself to ask. Perhaps because asking them felt dangerous, or because the people around you were not interested in that kind of conversation, or because you have been so occupied with the demands of living that genuine reflection seemed like a luxury. I want to ask you directly, when did you last truly examine something you believed without questioning whether it was actually yours? When did you last let yourself be uncertain about something you have been certain about for decades? And if this sense of having carried things you never fully examined lands somewhere in you, I want you to drop that phrase in the comments below. Just write, "This is my experience too." Because there are others watching this who need to know they are not the only ones living with that particular kind of weight. Your words create permission for someone else to finally name what they have been carrying alone. The second pillar is what Arendt called natality. This is one of her most original and most underappreciated concepts, and it is in some ways a direct counter to the way we tend to think about aging. The dominant cultural conversation associates aging with the movement toward death, with loss and diminishment and closure. And Arendt understood mortality. She did not minimize it, but she insisted that the more fundamental fact of human existence is not that we die, but that we are born. That each human being is, in her word, a beginning. That the capacity to initiate something genuinely new, to act in a way that could not have been predicted from everything that came before, is not a youthful capacity that fades with time. It is a structural feature of what it means to be human at all. Natality is the capacity to begin. And what makes this pillar so important for the freedom of old age is that it directly challenges the assumption that aging is essentially a story of foreclosure. We tell ourselves as we get older that the possibilities are narrowing, that we are increasingly defined by our history, that the options available to us are fewer than they once were, that genuine novelty is something that belongs to the young. And there is a surface truth to some of this. Certain literal options close over time, but Arendt's concept of natality points to something deeper and more durable than circumstantial opportunity. It points to the ineradicable human capacity to think and act in ways that break with what came before. Not because we are ignoring our history, but because we are relating to it consciously, which is itself a kind of beginning. Consider what it means to truly change your mind about something. Not to update a minor opinion, but to fundamentally revise a framework that you have been using to interpret your experience for years. This is an act of natality. It is not something that diminishes with age. In fact, there is a case to be made that it becomes more available with age if you have done the work of the first pillar, because genuine revision requires enough accumulated experience to know what you are revising and why. It requires a kind of ballast that only time can provide. The older person who changes their mind about something fundamental is exercising a freedom that is, in a real sense, more deliberate than the changes of direction that happen in youth, simply because the landscape of possibility is wide open. A person I know once described reaching her late 60s as the first time in her life. She felt she had permission to be exactly who she was, not who she had been trained to be, not who other people needed her to be, but the actual person she had been discovering through decades of experience and error and revision. She did not use Arendt's language, but what she was describing was natality, the recognition that even at 67, even with a fully particular history behind her, she was still capable of beginning, of acting in ways that surprised herself and her world, of refusing the story that aging is primarily a process of becoming more fixed, more determined, more identical with the self of the past. This matters practically because one of the most significant threats to freedom in old age is not physical decline or social marginalization, though both of these are real. It is the internalization of the assumption that you have become your history, that the person you have been is now the person you are, fixed and defined, no longer capable of genuine surprise. Arendt's natality insists that this is never true of a living human being. It is a philosophical error and a practical cage, and recognizing it as such, even in the abstract, can shift something fundamental in how you inhabit the days that remain. The third pillar is what Arendt called plurality, and this one is perhaps the most counterintuitive of the four, because it asks something of us that aging can make genuinely difficult. Plurality is the condition of human existence that says we are never alone on this earth, that the world is fundamentally a world of others, that our existence has meaning precisely because we share it with people who are irreducibly different from us. Arendt did not romanticize this. She was not saying that other people are wonderful or that community is healing in the self-help sense. She was making a harder and more interesting claim, which is that the self only fully appears, only becomes real to itself and to others, in the encounter with genuine difference. What does this mean for aging? It means that the temptation to withdraw, which can feel like wisdom, which can dress itself up as earned selectivity or justified exhaustion, actually carries a real cost. Not a social cost, not the cost of loneliness, though that is real too. A philosophical cost. Because if Arendt is right, the self is not something you can find in solitude alone. It is something that appears in the space between you and others. It requires the friction of encounter, the challenge of perspectives that do not simply confirm what you already think, the presence of people who are genuinely other than you and who therefore make demands on your capacity to see beyond yourself. Plurality asks you to remain in contact with people and ideas that genuinely challenge you, not to endure them but to recognize them as necessary, as the condition under which you continue to have a self that is growing rather than merely persisting. The older person who keeps relationships with people significantly younger than themselves, who stays genuinely curious about ways of seeing the world that feel foreign, who participates in conversations where they are not the authority but the student, that person is practicing plurality in the Arendtian sense. They are keeping themselves in the condition of genuine existence rather than the dignified exile that is available to all of us if we choose it. This also means being willing to be seen. Arendt wrote about what she called the space of appearance, the arena in which we reveal ourselves to others through speech and action. This space does not become less important in old age. In some ways it becomes more important because the stakes of what you reveal are higher and the self you are revealing is more fully formed. There is something remarkable about an older person who is still genuinely present in conversation, still willing to say something that surprises even themselves, still capable of being moved and challenged and changed by encounter. This is the third pillar in action. It is not performance, it is the ongoing commitment to remaining in the world, rather than merely observing it from a comfortable distance. The fourth pillar is the one Arendt herself perhaps lived most fully, and it is the one that brings the other three into coherence. It is what she called the vita contemplativa, the life of the mind, the inner life that exists not in opposition to engagement with the world, but as its necessary foundation. Arendt wrote about thinking, willing, and judging as the three fundamental activities of the mental life, and she saw them not as luxuries or supplements to a well-lived life, but as its essential core. Without thinking, we repeat. Without willing, we drift. Without judging, we lose the capacity to distinguish what matters from what merely demands attention. The vita contemplativa is the fourth pillar because it is what makes aging genuinely different from mere chronological accumulation. Without it, growing older is just the passive addition of years to a life that continues to run on its original programming. With it, aging becomes a process of genuine deepening, of increasing clarity, of the kind of wisdom that is not merely information about the world, but genuine understanding of one's own existence and its relationship to the larger human condition. This is what the ancient philosophical traditions meant when they spoke of aging as potentially the highest period of human life, not despite its limitations, but because of what those limitations, honestly confronted, can teach. What does the vita contemplativa look like in practice? It looks like taking seriously the inner life in a way that the busy years rarely permitted. It looks like reading not for information, but for genuine encounter with another mind. It looks like spending time with questions that do not have answers and refusing to retreat from them in frustration. It looks like developing, perhaps for the first time, a real relationship with your own mortality, not as a fact to be managed, but as the horizon that gives everything its weight and its color. Arendt understood that the awareness of death is not something to be overcome or softened. It is one of the conditions that makes genuine existence possible, because it is what makes time irreplaceable and choice meaningful. There is something that happens in the late stages of a life genuinely devoted to the vita contemplativa. The philosopher Gabriel Marcel described it as availability, a kind of radical openness to experience that is only possible when you have stopped trying to extract something from it. Arendt would have recognized this. She spent her life watching what happened when people stopped thinking, when they allowed their inner lives to atrophy in favor of function and efficiency, when they became, in her famous phrase, thoughtless. And what she saw was not just intellectual impoverishment. She saw something closer to a loss of humanity itself, the disappearance of the very capacity that makes a person more than their social role. The vita contemplativa is not passive. This is crucial to understand. Arendt was not suggesting that the examined life is a life of withdrawal from consequence. On the contrary, she believed that genuine thinking is the most demanding and most courageous activity available to a human being, precisely because it requires you to give up the comfort of received certainty and remain in the discomfort of real questions. The person who is genuinely thinking, in the Arendtian sense, is not retreating from the world. They are encountering it more honestly than most people dare. If what you have been hearing here resonates with something you have been searching for, something about how to inhabit your own aging with genuine freedom rather than managed decline, then I want to invite you to become part of this community. There are many of us exploring these questions together, not looking for easy answers, but willing to sit with the real ones. I create these videos for people who are not satisfied with what the culture offers, who know that the standard narratives about aging are inadequate to the actual experience of growing older. If that is you, consider subscribing. Not because you need another channel, but because this kind of thinking, rigorous and compassionate, is worth having as a regular companion. Hit the subscribe button if this feels like home, and let me know in the comments which of these 4 pillars landed most powerfully for you today. I read every comment, and your reflections frequently illuminate things I had not seen clearly myself. Now let me bring these 4 pillars into a single view, because what is remarkable about them is the way they speak to each other. The pillar of thinking creates the inner clarity, without which natality is just impulsiveness, without which plurality is just exhausting social noise, without which the vita contemplativa has nothing genuine to contemplate. The pillar of natality keeps thinking from becoming a closed loop, from turning into the endless refinement of already existing beliefs. It keeps the other pillars alive by insisting that newness is always possible, that the self is never finished, that every genuine act of thought is also a kind of beginning. The pillar of plurality prevents the inner life from becoming solipsistic, from mistaking the echo chamber of one's own unchallenged beliefs for genuine wisdom. And the vita contemplativa provides the depth and continuity that prevents the other 3 from remaining superficial, from being practices adopted and discarded, rather than orientations that gradually transform the character of an entire life. Together, these 4 pillars constitute something that our culture does not have a very good name for, but that you may have been circling for years. They constitute what it looks like to grow old freely. Not freely in the sense of being unconstrained by circumstance, which is never fully available to anyone, but freely in the sense that Arendt meant, the inner freedom that comes from genuine thought, genuine beginning, genuine encounter, and genuine depth. The freedom that is not taken from the world but earned through the examined engagement with one's own existence. And here is what I find most important about this framework. It does not require youth. It does not require perfect health or favorable circumstance or the absence of loss. The people who have most fully embodied these 4 pillars in the history of philosophy and literature and thought have often been people in the late stages of very difficult lives. Arendt herself, writing after exile and displacement and the experience of totalitarianism, was not working from a position of privilege or ease. She was working from a position of hard-won clarity. And what she demonstrated in her life and in her work was that freedom is not something the world gives you. It is something that is built slowly and with considerable effort from the inside out. This is why aging, approached with these 4 pillars in mind, is not simply a story of what is lost. It is a story of what becomes possible precisely because so much has been stripped away. The roles that defined you in midlife begin to loosen. The busyness that provided structure also provided avoidance. The accumulation of years, if you have been willing to think about them honestly, gives you a kind of ballast that makes genuine change more meaningful rather than less possible. You know what you're changing from. You know what the old patterns actually cost. You have, if you have been paying attention, the raw material of genuine wisdom. Not knowledge of how things work, but understanding of what things mean. I want to return to the person standing in front of the mirror, the one we met at the beginning of this exploration. They are still there. The dread is still there, or some version of it. The recognition that time is finite, that the future is shorter than the past, that something is being asked of them they do not yet fully understand. But I want to suggest that this dread, honestly entered rather than avoided, is itself a kind of doorway. It is the beginning of the first pillar, the moment where genuine thinking becomes not just possible but necessary. It is the occasion for natality, for beginning to relate to one's life differently. It is an invitation to plurality, to finding others who are asking the same questions and having the courage to ask them out loud. And it is the pressure that makes the vita contemplativa not an abstract aspiration, but an urgent, personal need. Arendt wrote in her final unfinished work about the life of the mind that thinking always returns to the same place, the present moment, the actual experience of existing right now, in this body, in this history, with this particular and irreplaceable life. All genuine philosophy, she suggested, is a circling back to the obvious, which is that we are here, that we exist, that this existence is strange and precious and limited and full, and that how we inhabit it matters more than almost anything else we could possibly do. The 4 pillars are not a path away from this, they are a path deeper into it. So if you are standing in front of that mirror, if you are feeling that particular kind of dread or that particular kind of question, I want to leave you with what I believe Arendt would say, which is this: the fact that you are asking is itself a beginning. The fact that you are here watching this, unwilling to settle for the 2 inadequate stories the culture offers you, is itself an act of natality. The examination has already started. The question now is not whether you will engage with these 4 pillars, but how deeply and how honestly you are willing to go. And that question, unlike so many of the questions aging raises, is entirely yours to answer.